I'm not that interested at the moment. And he basically, they said, well, if we get you more evidence to say that there's something more substantial to this case, will you look at it? And so he basically said yes. Now, one of the things that happened was that Ray Boucher, just out of the blue, thought, okay, I'm going to try to get hold of this Colonel Holt, who by then was a colonel, I think. And so he just rang him up. He managed to get his telephone number, and he rang him up out of the blue in April of 1985. Now, bear in mind, this is 6 years before Colonel Holt retires from the Air Force. So he's still under the guise of working for the Air Force, the military. Now, he introduces himself and he says, my name's Ray Boucher. I work for the Mutual UFO Network. I'm a researcher into UFOs. I've been looking at the Rendlesham Forest case. I've talked to a number of military witnesses. And he talked to Larry Warren. He talked to Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. He talked to one or two others. I think Greg Battram, another witness, an airman. And so he then said to him, well, from what my understanding, having spoken to these military witnesses, is that this is the scenario, that there was a landing of a 30-foot approximate craft in a field, that it was surrounded by US Air Force security police, like a cordon around it, that it was being filmed on motion picture cameras, i.e. movie cameras, moving images, not still pictures, that Colonel Williams, the base commander, was there. And he basically put those three things there. And he wrote Colonel Holt's response down. And this is crucial. He wrote his response to that scenario verbatim in his notes. And his response to that was, I can verify that, I can substantiate all of that for the senator. And he started, wrote that one line down. Now, this is 1985, long before Colonel Holt is this TV personality who's been in 30 or 40 documentaries, and who was denied any kind of involvement with the Larry Warren story of a second landing. He had totally poo-pooed it. No, there's no landing. It's all rubbish. No entities, no aliens in, as did Colonel Williams. Well, here we have this verbatim admission made in April of 1985. And basically, when I'd first spoken to Ray Boucher, who I didn't know, I read some of his research in old UFO documents, magazines, as it were, then. And I kind of got hold of him on social media, and I said, I don't suppose you've still got your notes from that time. And I didn't think he would have, because it was the 1980s. And I think this was 2018 when I first contacted him. And he said, well, I probably still will have somewhere. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, he's probably just being polite and I'll never see them. But anyway, about 3 weeks later, I suddenly get an email from him saying, I've scanned all my research papers. I found them. I scanned them all, and there's 345 pages of my research notes with Scott over this 3 year period. So I went, wow. And I'm kind of like an eager beaver when I get something like that. I can't let it go. I can't just say, well, I'll do a bit today, I'll do a bit tomorrow. I read it in one go and just worked through the night because I was so excited to see what he got. And literally, this is where this story of this telephone call came in. And it's got it written verbatim. And for those people who try to defend what I'm saying, who try to cast doubt that Holt made this admission, I also tender this, is that what happened was that, having met with Senator James Exxon and kind of got him interested, when Ray Boucher went back to Exxon trying to telephone him and say, look, I've got this interview and this admission from the deputy base commander, he wouldn't get a reply from Senator Exxon. Suddenly the mood had changed, and he'd ring up his staffers and say, can you get a message? Can you get him to ring me? And they'd say, no, he's busy. And basically, he never got to speak to him again. But what he did get told by one of the staffers was that Colonel Holt had actually gone and met with Senator Exxon. And suddenly, coincidence or not, everything had changed. Now, Ray Boucher was not someone to be put off lightly. So what he did was he wrote letter after letter after letter to Senator Exxon saying, look, I brought you this evidence. Why aren't you replying to me? Blah, blah, blah. And in his letters, a couple of which are highlighted in my book and reprinted, he would write out a detailed paragraph of the circumstances that led to that admission by Colonel Holt. And in it, he would say, on such and such a day, I rang Colonel Holt. I told him who I was. I gave him the scenario. And at the end, blah, 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 he said, I can verify all of that for the senator. So there was no ambiguity. This was verbatim. This was, in my mind, as a former police detective, a standalone, clear admission made long before Colonel Holt public eye, and it would stand as a really good admission. So if you think about that, not only do you have Sergeant Adrian Bustinza corroborating Larry Warren's original account in late 1982, you now had Colonel Holt actually admitting it way before he retired that it had happened. Everything that Larry Warren had said had happened. And it begs the question, where is that film? Larry Warren always believed that it went across to Germany and then was flown to Washington, D.C. Well, we're aware of other films that have been taken over the years and they end up in Washington, never to be seen again, presumably in a vault somewhere at the Pentagon. But that doesn't detract from the genuine admission written down verbatim that Ray Boucher got. And when you put text, that's a very powerful admission for me. And the fact that later on, Colonel Williams says, no, it never happened. I was never there. I didn't know anything about it. Well, that's a lie in itself, because he was the base commander of 12,000 personnel. It was the top strike base in Britain and Europe. So if the Soviet Union had come down through Denmark and all that kind of from the north towards the south and Europe or Central Europe, it would have been his aircraft from the squadrons at RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge that would have tried to halt the Soviet advance. Now, for him as the base commander not to know that something is going on in the forest involving what we now think on at least one of the nights, and this is a new thing that came out in the book, I had 3 servicemen admit that their shift had been held over. So normally there was about 40 per shift guarding tactical nuclear weapons. At RAF Bentwaters, some would be on mobile patrol. All in all, about 35 to 40. Plus there'd be what's called law enforcement, which was maybe another 6 to 10. And they were those who were doing basic proper police duties. So they would stop drunk drivers. They would break up fights in the bars and things like that. But the majority of people were involved in guarding tactical nuclear weapons. So you might have had, say, 40 to 50 US Air Force security police and law enforcement. Law enforcement is basically a police officer. All right, so you think you've got 50 per shift with those two together, and 3 airmen who I interviewed for the book said that their shift was held on. So they went from what we would call an afternoon shift, where they should have been off at 11 p.m. at night, and then they were held over because things were happening. Now, this may only be on one night, and the nights 42 years on is very difficult to pin down, but on at least one night they were held over. So that's not 40 to 50 people, that's 80 to 100 police officers around and about in the forest, available manpower, for want of a better word, even though you can't say manpower anymore. But in a sense, double the shifts. That meant that people were kept on and did a double shift, which means that there had to be something really serious going on to make people go into work all through the night and get off really early in the morning. So again, it's another indication that this was not just some kind of lazy little incident. This was a series of events. And in my book, in the conclusion, I break it down using my former police detective skills to break down the events. And there are 17 different timed events over the late December period. It's not just 1 or 2 nights. It's probably now 4 nights, because this admission by Sergeant Adrian Bustinza probably means that there was a 4th consecutive night. That might not actually be the case. There might be a day between, but it's of activity. So it looks to me like there are at least 4 nights of activity. Now, one of the things that's come out in those 17 different timed events was one that nobody had ever heard of. And you'll have never heard of it unless you'd read the book. And that's basically, I spoke to an airman called Steve Wagner. And he's got an interesting story to tell, because he basically had an earlier sighting in 1980. And it's one of the 3 main, what I call precursor cases that took place in February, July and November, leading up to those late December cluster of events. And when he'd reported his sighting, and he wasn't alone, he was with another airman, he got a lot of grief for it. And basically the authorities, his bosses, didn't want him to report what he'd seen. He was teased, ragged by his colleagues, and he thought, if I ever see anything again, I ain't going to report it, because I just want to keep my head down. And that's very understandable. He's young, he's early 20s. He just wants to keep his head down. He wants to have his career. Now, what he told me was that, and again, what I often do is when I talk to people, I say, you know, anything else ever happened during your service that was a bit odd? And sometimes it will work, and they'll, yeah, actually, yeah, there was this. And that's how that came out. And he basically said this. He said, well, I didn't report it, but there was something else that had happened. And he said it happened on the 23rd of December. And I'm thinking, 23rd of December? It's a long time ago. How certain are you that it's that? And he went, no, I'm pretty certain my shift pattern was before Christmas. I said, okay, it's your recollection. And basically he said that on the 20th night of the 23rd of December, so this is at least 2 days before the main events kick off with Jim Pennison and John Burroughs, what we term as the first night landing. A couple of days before, he's saying he gets called with a colleague, so he's not on his own, to go to the East Gate at RAF Woodbridge. Well, the East Gate at RAF Woodbridge plays a big part in the story. There's a lot of things in and around involving the East Gate. So it's well known. It's the back gate of RAF Woodbridge, and it backs on directly to the start of the forest, Rendlesham Forest. So it's very close. And he said an airman who had been at the East Gate, a police officer, had got spooked by something that had either dropped or landed in the clump of trees near to the East Gate. And I'm thinking, well, I've never heard anybody mention this kind of incident. And I said, you know, how far are we talking from the East Gate? And he said, 100 yards, 150 yards. Well, anybody that's ever been there, and there is a difference now, the original position of the East Gate in 1980 is not where it is now. If you go to the gate now, it's about 75 meters further down the road, as it were, towards the forest. So back in 1980, it was 75 meters back. So you then stand where originally it would have been, and then think 45 degrees to my right, 150 meters, 150 yards, or whatever you want to call it. But that's not far, and that's really close to the gate. And literally what we call the East Gate Road is the back military road that leads to the public road in the forest at the end, which is about 300, 400 meters away. So this is very, very close to the East Gate. Nobody had ever said this. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, we went to the airman because they said he'd been frightened by something. We saw him, and the airman was very upset, and he didn't want to get involved, but he said something happened, either landed or dropped into a clump of trees nearby, 150 meters away, yards. And they said, okay, we'll go have a look. Now, just before we get to the story bit, that's kind of interesting, because I'm told that the East Gate was not routinely manned. So US Air Force Security Police was not usually in a little sentry box by that gate. And they'd only do it if they were on alert or on an exercise. So it makes you think that maybe something was already going on, that an airman was there. That's the impression it gives to me. So anyway, go, okay, we'll take a look. Now, he said, we had roughly where this clump of trees were, he said, we went in there and there was a little clearing, and he said, we didn't see anything. There was no machinery, no flying saucer, whatever you want to call it. He said, but there was something. I said, well, what was it? He said, well, we found a triangular set of depressions, a perfect equilateral triangle in a little clearing near to the East Gate, effectively in a clump of trees. And I said, okay, that's interesting. And I said, how big were these? And he said, well, about 5 feet each. So think of a triangular platform depression, so like an undercarriage, and 3 equilateral indentations into the ground that he said were each of them 5 feet wide. Wow. Now, put that into contrast to the John and Jim's first night landing 2 nights later. They get equilateral triangle depressions, but they're only about 9-10 inches. So whatever came down, it infers that something much bigger with a much bigger triangular tripod kind of landing gear landed in that and created these huge depressions. But he said, I wasn't going to report it because I didn't want any more grief. So this is something that you can't actually verify. And he's lost contact with the other airman that was with him. And so this is a story from a first-hand witness, but you can't corroborate it. But there's no reason why this guy's going to come forward and tell me a lie. You know, he knows all the backbiting that's going on in the case. But he kind of was really respectful, and he kept calling me sir, as a lot of Americans do, a lot of military personnel, when you've been interviewed, yes, sir, yes, sir. And he wanted to tell the story because he wanted to kind of get things off his chest, which is what happened with a lot of the witnesses, including Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. You know, what he then told me in a subsequent Skype interview I had with Adrian Bustinza was about his interrogation. Now, we know that some people were interrogated, but he, at one point, I set up the interview and to try what's called the enhanced cognitive model. And it's a technique to try to retrieve memories. Now, it's not designed to be done 40 odd years after the event, but the basis is that if something incredibly important has happened in your life, whether it be a car crash, somebody suddenly dying, or, you know, you've been involved in something that's really unique, your brain will have recorded it. Your eyes will have seen it. It will have recorded it somewhere. And it's a question of, can you open or use a memory tool to maybe unlock a bit more of what was like. Your eyes are a bit like a video camera. They see and take in much more detail that you can ever recall. But it's like a running movie camera, and it's a question of just trying to trigger into that with memory tools. And, you know, will you let me try for this? And all it is basically asking him to concentrate, set it up in the right way, and then at some point you say, right, I'm now going to hand over the interview to you, and when you start speaking, I will not interrupt you for however long you talk. And he talked for about nearly 2 hours without me interrupting. Now imagine you doing that as a radio host, not to interrupt and clarify, and as a detective, not to interrupt and clarify. But it's called the first account. And when somebody's in the zone, you just let them flow. Because they might be retrieving fresh memories. And as soon as you say, yeah, but was it a brown door or a red door? It affects their train of thought, and it may be gone forever. So basically, in the enhanced cognitive model, you let that first account go, and you've told him, I'm not going to interrupt. So he feels like he's in charge, and he just came out and he talked And all the interviewee does is go, okay, and that's called Googling. And that basically is, you don't want to interrupt, but you want to acknowledge that you're listening, and you want to keep him in that zone. And when he was in that zone, he really got into it. And at one point, and I think it's one of the, if not the most powerful page in the entire book, is he talks about his interrogation and being taken into an underground facility that he said was the base photo lab at RAF Bentwaters, which Colonel Holt denies there's anything underneath that, but both Larry Warren and Adrian Bustinza say they were taken underground. They were taken by big burly guards, officers of special investigation. They were made to feel like they were criminals, taken down into a dingy place beneath Photo Lab, and then put into a room where there was one either side. You know, it's like almost a mafia kind of scenario. Sit down, you'll be questioned. And at one point, Sergeant Adrian Bustinza is threatened with his life. He's threatened that his father, who worked for the government, would lose his job and pension, and that their house in America was being surveilled by operatives. We don't know who. But at one point, he's threatened with his life, and he's told bullets are cheap, which is what Larry Warren said. Bullets are cheap. He was interrogated too. But he said, and it's palpable, he said, I was so disgusted. I joined the US Air Force to protect my country and do whatever was needed. And here I am being treated like a criminal. And I'm a sergeant. I've got an excellent record, you know, and you're talking to me like I'm a criminal. And threatened with my life. He was disgusted. And he said, when they threatened his life, he basically just wanted to get out there because he was really struggling to cope psychologically with what was going on. And he said, afterwards, he said, I was so disgusted. I wanted to go AWOL, absent without leave. He wanted to desert. And he loved his country, and he loved, you know, being in the Air Force. And there he was made to feel like a criminal. Now, not enough is made about his interrogations that have been acknowledged by Colonel Holt, who said, you know, the men were given dubious interviews and practices that shouldn't have happened. At least 2 of them were injected with sodium pentothal or some kind of truth serum to elicit more information. And here's an interesting thing. He said, I gave these people a statement. I asked for it and never got it. Now, according to the US Air Force, there are no statements other than the ones that have come out already, which is 5, which I talk about in the book, but they're very poor. But his statement that he asked for, he says it's there. And he said it's also tape recorded as well, these interviews, on audio tape as it was in the early 80s. So where's that? You know, where are those tapes? So you think about what I said to you about the video film. There's that evidence. There's the audio tapes that we're just talking about. But when you hear, as I did, because obviously I'd audio recorded this 4.5 hour transatlantic call. Now, I don't know about you, but, you know, doing a 4.5 hour transcript, handwritten, it basically took about 3 weeks, and you could only do it in bits because it's so hard to keep concentrating, you know, because you stop playing it back, making sure you've got the intonation right. Have I written it right? And anyway, suffice to say that when I was writing a segment, because obviously you can't relate all the pages of the 4.5 hours, as it'd be about 400 pages, just that alone. So you can't do it. So you take the highlights out. And I remember reading my notes back and playing it. And when I started proofing for the book, and I also do this with the magazine, UFO Truth magazine, is that whatever articles come in, I then read it back. And if there's a section of live voice that's quoted in commas, I do the voice. I put a voice on, a bit like an actor, to bring it to life, see how it reads. Well, when I did it with Adrian Bustinza, who'd been talking non-stop for 2 hours, and it's in amongst this period, when he's in this really concentrated, dark place of being interrogated, when I read it back like as an actor, it was like, wow, that's palpable. So if anybody's not read the book, I suggest that you do for that alone, because it gives you this sense of disgust at his treatment in a way that I've never seen anyone bring this up again to do with Rendlesham. And it's so powerful when you do it in that way. And, you know, there's so many things I could say.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, Karen.
No, I just have a quick question, because so, you know, I think when I first covered it, this story, I knew about the first two incidences. So it sounds like from the research you've done that there could have been many other incidences. Okay. Something that always, you know, stood out to me was the fact when they were talking about that it was filmed with like cinema cameras.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and again, we do know that, you know, even like with the Roswell crash, you know, there's again many other incidents where they as well have filmed. Do you think that this was continuing to happen, and then, you know, when it happened, you know, one of the other nights they had the film crew or they had the cameras ready this time, or where do you think that kind of
I think there is an element of that. Strangely, Larry Warren had always said that he has always felt that it was like a planned event because of the way it was set up. And, you know, you think, well, okay, what evidence is there to back that up? But in light of we're now knowing of other incidents, that we're not talking one night, we're not talking 2 nights, we're probably talking at least 4 nights of activity, consecutive nights. So if you think about that, that's an emerging story. Originally, there was just one incident. Then there was the Holt Memorandum, which outlined 2 incidents, but set 48 hours, well, 24 hours apart. So it used to be for many, many years, John and Jim's first night landing, and then 2 nights later, Colonel Holt led a team out into the forest, and that was all we knew. In between time, researchers have done a good job, and now we now know that another incident happened in between. So the second night is now involving a woman called Laurie Bowen, who again was a security police officer at the East Gate. She sees something drop into the forest. She rings up, tells Central Security Control, and they asked for someone to respond. Well, the first person who was on mobile patrol was a lady, an officer, a young black officer called Bonnie Tamplin, Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. And she goes over the radio, yeah, okay, I'll respond to that, not knowing what she may encounter. Now, what we knew was for many years was that something really upsetting had happened to Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin to make her, in a sense, go sick. She was screaming over the radio, help, help, help. Nobody knew what the real story was. And that's all we knew for many, many, many years. And then speaking to another airman I spoke to called Michael Stacey Smith. And Michael Stacey Smith was one of the guys who'd had an earlier 1980 sighting, had a good sighting. I then said again, anything else happened? And he said, well, I know a bit about what happened to Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. Well, nobody knew what had happened to her. We knew that something had happened and she'd gone off sick. No, there was like a big hole in the story. We didn't know. And he said, well, I was a part witness to some of it. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I was at RAF Bentwaters, which was one of the twin bases. And he said, an officer came up to me and said, go to the back gate of RAF Bentwaters, which is called the Butley Gate. And it opens up onto a little rural country road that links the 2 bases, basically. About 3 miles between the 2. And it was like, get down there quick, open up the back gate. And he didn't know why, He's following orders. So he gets to the gate, opens up the gate, and then he sees within seconds at least 3 or 4 US Air Force security police vehicles coming out in a convoy at speed. Don't know what they're doing, where they're going, and there's different audio channels, the radio channels. There's not just one, there's at least 3, possibly 4 radio channels, and he can only access the one he's on. So basically, he don't know what's happening, but there's something urgent. He observes these vehicles going out. Now, about 10 minutes later, one of those convoy vehicles comes back on its own, and it's been driven by Sergeant Robert Ball. And if you're out there, Sergeant Robert Ball, please contact me, because you've never really been asked the right questions. You've done a couple of little TV interviews, but you've never been questioned about this. And I think you know a lot more. If you get to hear of this, get to read the book, please contact me. I'd love to find out more and interview you. So anyway, basically, he's driving, and the front seat passenger that Michael Stacey Smith sees is Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. And she's disheveled. She's crying uncontrollably. It looks like she's been roughed up. She ain't got a berry on. She's, unkempt. And she's distraught. And he drives in, thinking, what happened to her? I don't know. But off she comes in. Another 10 minutes goes by, and then another vehicle turns up. But this time it's a vehicle that's sustained damage to its roof. And it turns out that it's Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin's vehicle. And it looks like it's been rolled. It's gone into a ditch or something like that. It's crashed onto its side. And anyway, it's drivable, and it's driven back through the gate. He still don't know what's gone on, happened to her. Now, bear in mind, nobody knew this story until I spoke to Michael Stacey Smith. Nobody knew this. So until the book comes out, which has been out since February now, nobody knew this. And basically, he went, after he closed the gate, he goes to see a sergeant in the control room that he knows, he's good friends with. And the sergeant said, I'll tell you what happened if you swear to me on your life that you will never reveal my name. And he said, fair enough, I won't. And he didn't. He didn't reveal the name to me. But he said, I'll tell you the story. So the sergeant says to him, she's driving on the lonely country road between the two bases, going from RAF Bentwaters to RAF Woodbridge. It's on a British rural country road. And then a sphere-like object, maybe the size of a car, pulls alongside of her silently and follows her at hedgerow height. So can you imagine you're driving along and, oh my God, what is that? She's terrified. She loses control of the vehicle. She goes into a ditch. She rolls the vehicle, hence the damage. So he's that first-hand witness to the damage sustained. When she crawls out of the vehicle, she finds that the object has stopped and is looking down at her as she's crawling out. It's just hovering there, frightening for anybody. She picks up her weapon and starts going, and then the object goes away at speed. Now, that's when she's on the radio going, help, 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 Bobby, right. Bobby Ball, Robert Ball. So it all fits the story that others have already corroborated. So that's the missing piece. And the sergeant said, yes, that's what happened. A weapon was left at the scene. She was so frightened, she was distraught. She was picked up by Sergeant Ball. The rounds that she discharged, which is a very serious thing to do. You have to discharge one bullet, but she discharged several at this thing. It was very serious. All the bullets were put back into the armory where all the bullets were, so that there was all the numbers matched. So nothing was out, it was all basically hidden and covered up.
Right, like a cover up.
And basically, it turns out that she was then, within days, flown back to the United States, never to really anybody to ever see again. She never went back on shift. And that's a story that was covered up by the US Air Force, and no doubt the British, if they'd been told, for all of these years until my book. And what a story. that is, we now know what happened to her. And I've located, she lives in Europe, and I've spoken, I've emailed some of her family, tracked them down, but she don't respond. Because clearly something very traumatic happened to her, and she's probably happy to just put it away. But yes, what a story. And absolutely no reason to disbelieve Stacey Smith. Why? What is it gain by lying to me?
It's funny because every time I talk to you, it seems like the more answers you get, the more questions it leads you to. And, it seems like this is a never ending, story. And I think that now with a lot more of, the soft disclosure that they're putting out, and that's for a whole nother, show, but hopefully more people will come out. And we're running out of time. So I would like to, at this point, even ask you to come back, because
still so much. Let me just give you how long have we got? We've got 5 minutes. Let me just give you a couple of little snippets.
Okay.
Guess what? All of the radio channels, I found out, were recorded on audio tape. So think about that. All the evidence that was there, all of the radio channels were routinely recorded. And let me tell you another guy, Steve Longero. He was inside the nuclear weapons storage area, and he sees the UFO shine a beam down. He's a direct person. He was inside. He saw the UFO shining the beam down. A direct first-hand witness of UFOs tampering with nuclear weapons. We should talk about that.
Wow. Well, again, I am going to need to bring you back on, because, again, there's so much. Put out the information of where they can find your book. And in the meantime, if people want to get it and read it, it's a great read.
It's called Non-Human, which is, I think, now with non-human intelligence become relevant in the States. And that's basically Non-Human, the Revolutionary Forest, UFO incidents, because I break it down into 17 different events over the late December period. And I say 42 years of denial, because the US Air Force, the British government, have covered this up and done its best to trivialize and disinform the public. And I'm trying to fight for the other witnesses who don't get a look in on the documentaries. There's lots more information. There's lots more witnesses that are out there. And the more the book is in a sense publicized, hopefully they'll get to hear about it and feel confident enough to come forward. We're living in an age now where the stigma's receding. We need to get witnesses on the record before they pass away.
Absolutely.
It's only available on Amazon, by the way.
All right. Well, everybody get to Amazon. Make sure to get a copy of it. Also, make sure to send me messages if you have questions. I'll have Gary back.
If anybody knows Robert Ball, Lieutenant Bruce England, please give me details so I can contact these people. They hold remarkable stories and have yet to tell them.
Absolutely. All right, Gary, thank you so very much. I will be in touch after the show. We will book another date so we can come back for part 2, because, again, I know there's just so much more to talk about and so much more to share. Plus, I want to get your opinion on the whole, disclosure and the UFO stuff that's coming out right now. So
yeah, I follow the events all the time.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much for being my first guest
Thank you
back.
for inviting me.
Absolutely. I'll have you back again soon. Thank you, everybody, tonight for joining us. I really appreciate it. Make sure to share this link to all of your friends and all of your groups so that we can, get the information out. And make sure to let everybody know that you can come see me every Thursday at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Love you all. Thank you so very much. Good night.
The truth is here and now on WLTK-DB Talk Radio at WLTKDB.com.